So thank you, Sam, and good afternoon to everyone here and on Zoom. The current consumer price inflation rate was determined by the Statistical Office to be 1.3% as of September. Now, that is relevant for every household in the sense that if your income rose by less than 1.3%, you can actually buy fewer things this year than last year. Now, what exactly do we mean by 1.3%? Let me give you a short example on this. If, let's say, food prices rose dramatically during the last year, a poor household with kids who might spend the biggest portion of their budget on food might see their inflation increase by a lot. But a single household that has a high income might, in the same period, only see their prices increase by very little. So this 1.3% are not very informative for the single household, and that's why we think that inflation should rather look like this. Now, what is the difference between looking at inflation individually or calculating individual inflation rates? The difference is that we use an expenditure survey, and we take the price increases of the goods that you actually consumed instead of just taking averages over the whole population. What the Statistical Office does, they take the average over the whole population and then claim that the food prices are 10% overall. But as we saw in the example before, it might be very different from household to household. Now, are these differences relevant? And for this, we have to look at the data. This is the official CPI inflation rate over the last 40 years, as calculated by the Statistics Office. And here is our computation of the individual inflation rates. As you can see, inflation differs widely across households, and it can also be far away from the official line. Now, we want to put this new information to good use, and for this, we go back to one of the standard questions in monetary macroeconomics, and that is what can the central bank that you see on the left, what can it do to inflation? The central bank's main objective is to keep inflation low, and its main tool to do it is the interest rate. Now, I hope you caught me when I said inflation, because almost all studies that look at this, they look at the official aggregate inflation rates, and what we're interested in is the individual inflation rates. And for this, we do the same analysis that we would do for the aggregate rate, and we filter out all the effects that have nothing to do with the interest rate, and we can see that if we have a surprise interest rate shock at period 0, this is the poor households that we look at first, and we can see that inflation stays roughly constant for about 2 years and then gradually decreases. Now let's compare that to a richer household, and the richer household has a different consumption bundle, and so it starts off at a lower inflation rate already on average, but you can also see in this graph that the inflation decreases less than the poor household's inflation, and this leads to a convergence in inflation rates. The inflation rates get more similar over time. Now, this is an interesting result in itself, but we can also put it to good use. For instance, going back to the example I said in the beginning about the rich and the poor household, if we look at consumption inequality, which essentially is this difference, we don't only want to look at differences in consumption levels, but we also want to look at how these prices develop differently. And for this, talking about consumption inequality, we refer to a paper that looks at exactly this. It's the same interest rate shock in period 0, and Koibian and co-authors, they found that consumption inequality increases after a shock. Now, they assume that prices can change over time, but they assume that these prices change for everybody in the same way. And if we control for these different developments of prices, we can see that the effect is roughly a third lower than what they predicted. So to wrap up everything, we saw that the inflation of poorer households decreases more, substantially more than the one of higher income households. And this is also very important for central banks because the inflation of poorer households is more reactive to central bank policy changes. And lastly, what we saw is that consumption inequality increases by less than what was predicted when not accounting for these effects. So all in all, if we take inflation to be the same for everyone, we lose a lot of valuable information. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Christoph. Are there any questions from the audience? No questions from the audience. I will come up with a question.
All right.
Don't worry. Don't worry. I am not an economist. How often do, let's take the case of Switzerland. Over the period that you showed, in the last 40 years, how many changes were there? How many changes of interest rates were there in that data set?
The question was, how many actual interest rate changes are there? And it is the case that we don't take actual interest rate changes because interest rate moves naturally with other aggregate variables like consumption and GDP. But what we look at is, given all the information there is at a point in time, does the central bank act in a surprising manner? So does it surprise the market in that it unexpectedly increases or decreases interest rates? And so this is basically an estimation. And so we have a lot of small changes, and also we can say that the central banks have gotten better. So these changes have gotten smaller, and the central bank acts more predictably in a way than 40 years ago.
Okay, and is there a correlation between the effect of surprise and the amplitude of the change? In other words, is your reference point, the time zero, always reflecting a big change in inflation, in interest rate? Sorry.
The question was if a big change in the interest rate has a different effect than a small change in interest rate. And the thing is, yes, it does, but actually what we have here is a linear model. So everything just scales up linearly in our model, but that is more a limitation of the methodology than me claiming that it really behaves linearly. But to answer your questions, we can't be for sure with linear methods, whether that's the case or not.
Thank you. Yes?
I was wondering if you were suggesting that the people who set interest rates could use the potential to shock the economy as a device in some way. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, exactly. The question is whether the central bank can use the interest rate to shock the economy. And that is exactly true. They have a mandate to keep inflation between 0 and 2% in Switzerland, to take the Swiss example. And what this means is if they think that inflation will overshoot, they will take aggressive measures, and it's their objective to shock, to influence inflation rates in the medium term. As you saw, it's not that they shock today and tomorrow inflation is completely different, but it takes a couple of years to have effect.
And do people try and predict this? And try and somehow get ahead of the market or something like that?
Yes, that's actually pretty close to what we're doing. We're trying to predict what happens when inflation rates increase.
But not for monetary gain?
Not, I mean, I hope the central bank doesn't do it for monetary gain, but I mean, if you have further information, you can, and you're a trader, you can certainly also exploit this in a monetary way.
Excellent. Thank you, Christoph.
Thank you.